I'm delighted to be able to speak to you today. I'll be talking today about explainable and reliable AI, comparing deep learning with adaptive resonance. The lecture is based on the following article about explainable AI that I published last year in Frontiers in Neurobotics, where I summarize core problems of deep learning, such as its untrustworthiness because it's unexplainable, and its unreliability because it experiences catastrophic forgetting. I also explained how adaptive resonance theory overcomes these problems, indeed overcomes 17 foundational problems of deep learning, while outlining a blueprint for achieving autonomous adaptive intelligence. In fact, I just published this past week a new book from Oxford University Press called Conscious Mind, Resonant Brain, How Each Brain Makes a Mind, which explains not only this issue, but really gives quite a comprehensive view of models of how brains make minds. The article, though, is part of a Frontiers in Neurobotics special edition about explainable AI, where the editors wrote, although deep learning is the main pillar of current AI techniques and is ubiquitous in basic science and real-world applications, it's also flagged by AI researchers for its black box problem. It is easy to fool, and it also cannot explain how it makes prediction or decision. Excuse me. So in this sense, deep learning is not trustworthy. No life or death decision, such as a medical or financial decision, can confidently be made based upon a deep learning prediction because you don't know why it makes the prediction. Deep learning uses the backpropagation algorithm to learn how to predict output vectors in response to input vectors. Backpropagation, in turn, was based upon perceptron learning principles due to Frank Rosenblatt. It has a complicated history. Schmidt-Yuba has a lovely comprehensive review of its development last year. And major contributors include Shinichi Amari, Paul Werbos, and David Parker. And perhaps you might say that backpropagation reached its modern form when Paul Werbos simulated applications in 1974. Then 12 years later, Rumelhart, Hinton, and Williams popularized it. So here's a schematic of a backpropagation circuit in a figure printed, so sorry, from a review article of Gail Carpenter in '89. First, information flows in a feed-forward direction from an input to an output stage. There is a target input so that learning is supervised with an external teacher giving you the correct answer on each trial. The teaching signal is an error or mismatch signal between the actual output and the target output. But the teaching signal in level F3 teaches adaptive weights in level F2, but there's no pathway directly between 3 or even indirectly between 3 and 2. Someone uses an artificial weight transport mechanism as a teaching signal, a mechanism that's both non-local and therefore non-biological. Moreover, there's slow learning. The adaptive weights can just change just a little bit to reduce the error on each learning trial. So it requires many trials, that is, many repetitions of the database, sometimes hundreds or even thousands of repetitions. This is in contrast to fast learning, when the adaptive weights zero the error signals on each trial. For example, you can learn a face that you see just once and remember it for a very long time. or you can notice the first outbreak of a new, the first report of a new disease outbreak. Even more concerning, backprop experiences catastrophic forgetting. During any learning trial, an unpredictable part of its learned memory can collapse. So deep learning is neither reliable due to catastrophic forgetting nor trustworthy. Well, why does this happen? It's because all inputs are processed by a shared set of adaptive weights. The algorithm cannot selectively buffer learned weights that are still predictably useful against catastrophic forgetting. That is, it has no attentional mechanism. Moreover, this problem occurs in any learning algorithm whose shared weight updates follow the gradient of the error in response to the current batch of data points. Now, there have been multiple efforts to fix backpropagation. For example, one can try to selectively slow learning, quote, on the weights important for supervised learning and reinforcement learning problems by optimizing parameters using the Bayes rule. But this assumes an omniscient observer who can discover and alter just the important weights. And it's also, again, non-local because it uses Bayes. The same problems occur with evolutionary algorithms, with diffusion-based neuromodulation, and indeed all of the other efforts to repair backpropagation that I'm aware of. So these efforts to overcome catastrophic forgetting created additional conceptual and computational problems. I view them as adding epicycles to ameliorate a fundamental flaw in the model, which to me are reminiscent of adding epicycles to correct problems in the Ptolemaic model of the solar system. And as you know, the Copernican model swept away the Ptolemaic model, and it didn't require epicycles. Well, perhaps this is why Geoffrey Hinton, who's one of the developers of backpropagation and deep learning, said in Axio several years ago, quote, "I'm deeply suspicious of backpropagation. I don't think it's how the brain works. We clearly don't need all the labeled data. My view is throw it all away and start over." I would contend we don't have to start over because these problems were solved in the 1970s and 1980s. In fact, in my 1988 article in the first issue of the journal Neural Networks, I listed 17 problems of backpropagation that were overcome by adaptive resonance theory, and here they are. So, in particular, as to Hinton saying we don't need all the labeled data, indeed, the third property of adaptive resonance theory is it can carry out self-organized unsupervised learning in addition to supervised learning. And the unsupervised learning doesn't need labels. As to the problem of slow learning, another property of adaptive resonance theory is you can have either fast or slow learning. Indeed, Gail Carpenter and I showed in the late 80s examples of art models that can learn to classify an entire database using fast learning on a single learning trial. So art overcomes all the 17 problems of backpropagation without epicycles, and moreover, all the core art predictions have been supported by subsequent psychological and neurobiological data because art is more than an algorithm, it is a principled biological and technological theory that's explained data in a principled and unifying fashion from hundreds of experiments, and it's made scores of predictions, in fact, all its foundational hypotheses that have subsequently received experimental support. Well, why is art so successful? One index of why is I've derived art from a thought experiment about a universal problem in error correction. I did it 41 years ago in a paper in Psychological Review. The thought experiment asked the question, how can a coding error be corrected if no individual cell knows that one has occurred? The importance of this issue becomes clear when we realize, I'm now quoting my article, that erroneous cues can accidentally be incorporated into a code when our interactions with the environment are simple, and will only become evident when our environmental expectations become more demanding. Even if our code perfectly matched a given environment, we would certainly make errors as the environment itself fluctuates. So what I was talking about was autonomous learning using only local laws in a changing world. And so a purely logical inquiry into error correction is translated at every step of the thought experiment into processes learning autonomously in real time with only locally computed quantities. Moreover, the thought experiment uses familiar environmental facts that are familiar because they've acted as ubiquitous evolutionary pressures about how we learn as its hypotheses. And art circuits naturally emerge from these familiar facts. So we don't have to base the theory on things we don't know. It's very fundamental. So because of this, art-like circuits may be expected to be embodied in all future models of truly autonomous adaptive intelligence, whether biological or artificial. And art has, probably for this reason, already succeeded in many large-scale applications. For example, very early on, ArtMap, which is the supervised version of art, which you can also learn in an unsupervised setting, did very well in benchmark studies. In database benchmarks, its accuracy was higher on machine learning algorithms using a training set an order of magnitude smaller. Against backpropagation, it learned orders of magnitude faster. Against medical databases, it got much better predictive accuracy than statistical methods. For a letter recognition database, it did the same thing with genetic algorithms. And it's been used in applications where the algorithms totally fail. For example, the Boeing CAD group technology needed part design reuse and inventory compression. They needed fast learning and stable memory to learn and search a huge and continually growing part inventory. At that time, there were 16 million, 1 million dimensional vectors in their inventory. And more generally, art has been shown to work in many large-scale applications in engineering technology. If you're interested in looking at some of them, look at techlab.bu.edu, the webpage, and here is just a summary of some of them: the Boeing satellite remote sensing, radar identification, robot controlled machine vision, object recognition, operating software, target recognition, ECG wave recognition, and on and on. And this is just a very small subset. As to satellite remote sensing, Gail Carpenter took the lead in contrasting how ArtMap can learn remote sensing to make maps versus expert systems. So an expert system took a year to build a map. And first it had to derive ad hoc rules, which were derived by expert geographers. And it needed to give correct site labels for up to 250,000 sites with a pixel size of 230 meters. ArtMap in one day got that accuracy and did not need any of the rules, and it had a pixel size that was an order of magnitude smaller. Carpenter went on to show how you could get information fusion in remote sensing, where you might have different observers collecting remote sensing data from different and overlapping areas and using very different labels to classify what they were seeing. And basically, the data could have been incomplete. You could have had missing data. It could have been probabilistically defined. And Gale showed how you could derive algorithmically using art consistent knowledge from inconsistent data by incrementally learning and stably storing one-to-many maps. And along the way, Gale showed how you could self-organize a hierarchy of cognitive rules. So it was a rule discovery engine. And this illustrates 3 levels of the hierarchy that it autonomously discovered, along with estimates of how confident these correlative links are. So art works. It's been used successfully in many large-scale applications. More recent work about art is summarized in a special issue of Neural Networks in December 2019 with Donald Wunsch as one of the main editors. And here are just 2 of the articles in that special issue, if you want to read further about that. Well, backpropagation is a feed-forward adaptive filter, but art is much more than a feed-forward adaptive filter, and that's where it derives its strength. Art is an explainable, self-organizing production system that's capable of working well in a non-stationary changing world. It's self-organizing because it can autonomously carry out arbitrary combinations of unsupervised or supervised learning with the world as its only teacher. It's a production system because it uses hypothesis testing, as I'll illustrate in a moment, to discover and learn rules by a top-down matching process. These are learned expectations that focus attention on what are called critical feature patterns. These are the patterns that predict behavioral success while suppressing irrelevant features. It's explainable because it uses both its activities or short-term memory, i.e. STM traces, and its adaptive weights or long-term memory, LTM traces. The short-term memory traces, in particular in a critical feature pattern, the attended features, these are the ones that are incorporated into recognition categories, and these are the ones that predict goal-oriented action. So looking at critical feature patterns, you know why the prediction is made that's made. Moreover, the long-term memory traces in the fuzzy algorithm can be translated into fuzzy if-then rules that not only tell you what combinations of features are critical, but the numerical ranges that they can come in and still be effective. So the art mechanisms that define it as an explainable self-organizing production system include, of course, that it is a bottom-up filter, but that's supplemented by the learned top-down expectations that can focus attention, as well as 2 types of recurrent inhibition that help to choose the best matching recognition categories and focus attention on the critical feature patterns. Well, if you ask how do the top-down expectations work, they use what I like to call the art matching rule that focus attention on the critical features that control predictive success. So this art matching rule stabilizes learning and thereby avoids catastrophic forgetting while regulating expectation and attention. So here's the circuit. Gil Carpenter and I introduced it in 1987. You could have bottom-up input features that activate a pattern of activation across feature detectors. They could do it all by themselves. If you activate a category, it can try to activate features in the critical feature pattern, but it can only modulate or sensitize them because these excitatory top-down signals are balanced against the broader inhibitory of surround. However, if you are experiencing bottom-up and top-down signals at the same time, then if they're in the critical feature pattern, you have two excitatory and one inhibitory. So these cells can be a suprathreshold activated, synchronized. Whereas if you're outside the critical feature pattern, it's 1 against 1, and you're suppressed as being an outlier irrelevant feature. Moreover, in 1999, I was able to start introducing laminar cortical circuits for object attention, where layer 6 at a higher cortical level would activate layer 6 of a lower cortical level, either directly or through layer 5. And that would feed bottom-up excitatory signals to layer 4, as well as an inhibitory off surround. And this is a modulatory on-center driving off surround that is embodied by what I call folded feedback, because the signaling is folded from layer 6 to layer 4 in the lower cortical area. And so this is an example of the paradigm of laminar computing that I introduced with my colleagues, which asks, why are all neocortical circuits organized in layers, and how do laminar circuits give rise to biological intelligence? So what is an adaptive resonance then? The attended feature clusters, the critical features at the feature level, activate the bottom-up adaptive filter. The activated category activate the top-down learned expectations. This positive feedback loop closes, giving rise to a feature category resonance among the attended features and the active category that synchronizes, amplifies, and prolongs system activity. And it's resonance that triggers learning in the bottom-up adaptive filters and the top-down learned expectations, which is why the theory is called adaptive resonance theory. So feature category resonances support conscious recognition of visual objects and scenes. And in a homologous way, stream shroud resonances support conscious hearing of auditory qualia. There's been a lot of experimental support for art predictions, including that attention has an on-center of surround, and that attention can facilitate matched bottom-up signals. And one shouldn't take it for granted because it's inconsistent with models where top-down matching is fully suppressive, as in these Bayesian models by excellent theorists. Art's explainable or trustworthy because in short-term memory, the critical feature patterns determine the attentional focus that controls information processing. And in long-term memory, the same critical feature patterns determine the adaptive weights learned by the bottom-up adaptive filter and the top-down expectation. Art is reliable. It doesn't go through catastrophic forgetting. One reason being that outlier features that are not in the intended critical feature pattern where learning occurs are actively suppressed. Only these predictive features are processed and coded. Looking to what is a production system that carries out hypothesis testing, the ARC-1 model that Carpenter and I introduced in '87 is the simplest example of this, in which you have an attentional system where the category learning occurs, and an orienting system that helps you to respond to new inputs coming in, driving searches to find the best categories to be associated with particular critical feature patterns. And this happens according to the following ART hypothesis testing and learning cycle, where for simplicity, one arrow is really a vector here that might be thousands and thousands of pathways. So let's say you just have a bottom-up input vector, feature vector, that's going to activate feature detectancy at different degrees. At the same time, each of these pathways is trying to turn on an orienting system or novelty-sensitive system. But the active features are inhibiting the orienting system, and there are about as many excitatory as inhibitory signals in the bottom-up mode as the active feature pattern goes through the adaptive filter and chooses a category. The category now reads out a learned top-down expectation that obeys the ART matching rule, and a subset of these features may be inhibited, thereby reducing inhibition on the orienting system. So raising the question of how big a mismatch between excitation and inhibition can be endured before the orienting system gets activated. That's controlled by a parameter called vigilance. And when there's too much excitation for inhibition, the orienting system gets activated and you get an arousal burst that non-specifically hits all cells in the category layer because you don't know which cell was wrong to have caused the reset. But the category layer is designed so only cells that are active are selectively inhibited. So now the top-down expectation is eliminated and you go through the bottom-up filter again. But up here you have a recurrent network that renormalizes activity. So now another pattern can be activated and you go through the cycle again. So there's a dynamic cycle of resonance and reset, and it's a theorem that as categories are learned, the search process automatically disengages and you get direct access to the globally best matching category. So it solves the local minimum problem, and it explains how you can quickly recognize familiar objects like your mom's face, even if you've learned many other things in the years since you first learned to recognize mom. There's a lot of experimental support for the hypothesis testing cycle, the mismatch arousal reset cycle, event-related potentials, the P120, N200, P300, will all get activated in the predicted sequence if you measure them by event-related potentials, that's to say scout potentials, during oddball learning experiments. Jean-Paul Banquet and I made that prediction and successfully tested it in 1987. There's also neurophysiological support for it because cells in the infratemporal cortex where category learning occurs are actively reset between trials. Bob Desimon's lab showed that in '91. There's also what I call complementary computing going on in ART. In particular, there's a processing negativity event-related potential in addition to the M200 that I just mentioned, the PN is active in a match phase and the M200 in a mismatch phase. And if you look at these properties, top down, bottom up, conditionable, unconditional, specific, non-specific, match, mismatch, these are the properties of when these waves occur. They're manifestly complementary. So this illustrates another new paradigm that I introduced called complementary computing, which asks what is the nature of brain specialization. Complementary computing introduces new principles of uncertainty and complementarity that clarify why multiple parallel processing streams and multiple processing stages exist in the brain. This is a famous macro circuit of the visual system by Van Essen and his colleagues. There's a lot of specialization here, but there's such strong interactions you could not call them independent modules. Well, then what are complementary properties? They're analogies like a key fitting a lock or puzzle pieces fitting together. Let me first say in words and give you some examples. Computing one set of properties at a processing stage prevents that stage from computing a complementary set of properties. And these complementary parallel processing streams are balanced against one another. It's a very yin and yang kind of situation, such the interactions between the streams overcome their complementary weaknesses and support intelligent behavior. And I could say now with some confidence that we know quite a few pairs of complementary processing streams, their functions, their anatomical and neurophysiological substrate. This is just a subset of them. The brain has a global organization into multiple scale complementary processing streams. So let's review a little. Backpropagation and deep learning do not have any short-term memory activation patterns, in particular, no critical feature patterns to pay attention. Indeed, they have no fast information processing. They also have no learned top-down expectations, so they can't carry out hypothesis testing. Moreover, there's no neural architecture, as you find with complementary computing. Let me point out how easy it is to get catastrophic forgetting. Carpenter and I showed this in '87. Let's say that you shut off the arc matching rule. Then if you just have 4 input vectors, A, B, C, D, and you present them cyclically, A, B, C, A, D, again, A, B, C, A, D, again, A, B, C, A, D, then you can get catastrophic forgetting if these vectors obey some very general subset relationships. So here you have stable coding ABCAD. It stabilizes on the second trial. And here you have an example without the arc matching rule of unstable coding, in which this input pattern cyclically gets classified by 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2. It never ends. Well, what about vigilance? Vigilance determines what features are learned in the critical feature patterns. It can show how we learn both concrete and abstract knowledge in a task-dependent way, where high vigilance gives you narrow and concrete categories, like a frontal view of your mom's face. Low vigilance gives you broad categories and abstract knowledge, like everyone has a face. Moreover, critical feature patterns are explainable at every level of vigilance. And there's a lot of data supporting vigilance control. Early data, again, came from the Desimones lab. And in fact, they did a lovely physiological study in '88 showing that if you have a difficult versus an easy discrimination, the animals behave in the difficult discrimination as if their vigilance has gone up. Well, how do you compute vigilance? It's very simple. Let's say you have an input, a feature vector, trying to activate feature detectors. Vigilance is just the gain of the feature vector that tries to turn on the orienting system. And then the feature pattern here tries to inhibit the orienting system. And if the feature pattern can inhibit the input to the orienting system, then it stays quiet, and so the system can resonate and learn. But if you have too big a mismatch, then you'll get reset and search. It's as simple as that. So that raises the question, though, of how do you change vigilance based on predictive success? And here we have to go to supervised art models, the so-called art map, and this is the case of fuzzy art map, where you classify patterns here you classify answers, and then you have a map field that associates pattern categories with their answers. And so you can have either many-to-one learning, where many inputs all have the same name, or you can have one-to-many maps, where in response to a single object, you can know many, many things about it. Many-to-one maps require two stages of compression. First, like with these letter fonts, you would learn categories based on visual similarity. Here you would learn to produce the prediction A for the letter A, and you'd have an associative map. You could do it with anything. You could do it with medical database prediction. The vector can have to do with simples, tests, and treatments, and the prediction can be how long will you stay in the hospital. In terms of the many-to-one maps, if you have the Dalmatian, first you might predict it's a dog, but then you might have a shift of attention to look at features that make you realize, oh, that's my dog Rover. You'd learn another visual category, it'd be associated with another name, and the set of all of these predictions would coexist without catastrophic forgetting, being organized later in working memory and chunking to predict the object in an invariant way. Well, how do you conjointly minimize prediction error while maximizing generalization using only local principles? It's very simple. Suppose that you made a prediction. In order to make it, vigilance must have been less than the analog match here that you were able to establish. But if it's a predictive error, that'll give rise to a mismatch. And what the mismatch does is it increases vigilance until it's just above the analog match and can drive a search. So because low vigilance gives you general categories and higher vigilance gives you more concrete ones, you give up the least amount of generalization that you can to correct the error. That is to say, it's a minimax learning principle. And you can show how all this works in a laminar cortical setting, the so-called synchronous matching art model that I developed with my PhD student and postdoc Max Versace, uses spiking neurons and has a great deal of verisimilitude, and is another example of laminar computing. Here is the macro circuit of SMART. You can see all of these cortical layers, all their complex interactions. It gives functional explanations of a ton of data about these cortical interactions that no other theory has given, and it's made predictions. For example, if you have a good enough bottom-up, top-down match, you can get fast gamma oscillations. Some labs have reported that without explaining it. But we also showed if you have a bad enough mismatch, you'll get slower beta oscillations. This was new. And now it's been confirmed in 3 parts of the brain by at least 4 different labs. So it's a confirmed prediction. Moreover, we showed how vigilance could be explained when you have a mismatch in the nonspecific nucleus of the thalamus that activates the nucleus basalis, that triggers the release of acetylcholine in layer 5 of cortex, thereby reducing after hyperpolarization currents and increasing vigilance. What about direct access to the globally best matching category? Well, if the orienting system fails, you get amnesia. You don't get the normal phase of memory consolidation that you would normally have. Instead, you have a very detailed understanding of what goes wrong when there's a hippocampal lesion, and you get medial temporal amnesia. That's a little beyond what we need to understand today. If you want now, however, to see what's the role of inferotemporal cortex here, where category learning occurs, this can be seen in a much more general neural architecture, which I call predictive art or PART. This explains many, many facts about biological intelligence. In particular, it shows how the prefrontal cortex learns to control all higher order intelligence. I have an article in 2018 about it. It's also thoroughly reviewed in my new book. Here is posterior and anterior inferotemporal cortex, where category learning and object attention occur. But in addition, working memory, learned planning, prediction, and optimized action occur in these prefrontal areas. Reinforcement learning, emotion, motivation, adaptively timed learning occur in these areas, and all these areas regulate visual perception. This is very, very different from the homogeneous organization of a deep learning network shown here, because each brain region in nature and in the predictive architecture carries out a different function in a highly parsimonious fashion. And so, to summarize, perceptual and cognitive processes use art like excitatory matching and match-based learning to create self-stabilizing, attentive, and conscious representations of the world. The complementary spatial and motor processes use inhibitory matching and mismatch-based learning to continually update our spatial and motor representations to compensate for bodily changes throughout life. Together, they provide a self-stabilizing perceptual and cognitive front end for conscious awareness and knowledge acquisition, which can intelligently manipulate the more labile spatial and motor processes that enable our changing bodies to act effectively on the world. And all of this and much more is explained in my new book. And so I would like to end and thank you for your attention to my lecture.